So, what we're going to do today is do a quick module. It's only one day, and it's called Competing Views in Macroeconomic Theory. As we have noted, recessions still exist despite attempts to avoid them. And we've talked a little bit about this idea that there's still disagreement among people about how to best combat recessions. And there's different views of what determines output, inflation, interest rates, etc. Some of those differences include things like what causes changes to aggregate demand or aggregate supply. Disagreements over whether aggregate demand or aggregate supply shifts cause most recessions. Discussion of the importance of the multiplier versus crowding out. And the best way to intervene during an economic downturn. The first one that we're going to look at is what we call the mainstream view. The mainstream view is most of what we have done in this course. And if we were to briefly summarize it, we would say instability in expenditures creates instability in the economy. So what we mean by instability of the macroeconomy, the ups and downs of the business cycle. So if you remember, most of what we've talked about as triggering recessions and expansions are changes in aggregate demand. That's what we mean by instability in expenditures. And we said that the instability primarily comes from investment because investment is the one that maybe is most dependent on the interest rates, right? We talked about government spending and consumption, or sort of they are what you want, that they are what they are. You decide you want to buy a car this year, you buy a car this year. The instability primarily comes from investment. And we said that instability is driven then by aggregate demand. What causes downturns and how to correct them? Well, we need to worry about aggregate demand if we're trying to fix things. Okay, so that's the mainstream view. And again, that's what we've basically done up until now. I haven't called it the mainstream view, but that's what we've been learning. That's what we've been doing. Next, we have the monetarist view. So the mainstream view suggests that during a depression, monetary policy will be relatively ineffective. Remember, we talked about the liquidity trap. There's only so low you can take interest rates. And so really, you can think about it as what the mainstream view is getting at is during the recession, monetary policy doesn't really do much. And related to this is that there is a general view after the Great Depression that fiscal policy, stimulating aggregate demand through government spending, had ended the recession, the depression. Monetary policy was seen as less important. So the idea here was we had the New Deal, we had World War II, huge increases in government spending, and there was a general view that that's what had taken us out of the depression. Well, the monetarist view, it emphasizes the importance of monetary policy. This is Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz. There are a couple of the people who sort of pioneered this viewpoint. Again, let's sort of think about it as what they were coming out of the Great Depression. The consensus was, monetary policy isn't very important, and the monetarist view is going to sort of go against that. And the monetarist view is the Great Depression could have been avoided if the Fed had expanded the money supply. So too much money in the economy leads to inflation. Not enough money in the economy leads to a recession. So what we're saying is the Great Depression was caused by there not being enough money. If the Fed had just gone out, expanded the money supply, then we would have been able to avoid the whole problem. One appeal of monetary policy is that it does not involve politicians making political choices. For example, whose taxes to cut or what type of government spending to increase. Another way to think about this is everyone's interest rate changes together, right? With government spending, we're going to have to decide what to increase. With interest rates, well, everyone's interest rate changes together. Friedman actually argued for a non-activist monetary policy in which the money supply increases by a consistent percentage every year, regardless of any fluctuations in the economy. So the monetarist view, one of the reasons why it was more skeptical of activist, what we call activist monetary policy, so the Fed going in and making, being very concerned and making a lot of changes to the money supply, is that there's a lag between when a recession occurs and when policies actually take place. Well, that lag, they argue that it reduces the effectiveness of fiscal and monetary policy and can actually make the economy less stable. So if I'm getting ready to do business during the recession, in addition to worrying about the recession, I also have to worry about, well, what's the government going to do about it? I'm kind of concerned that they're going to make some change that has a big effect on interest rates. And so this uncertainty here could actually work to make the economy less stable. Monetarist View also emphasizes the importance of crowding out. If you remember, we talked about this when we were discussing fiscal policy and the limitations of it. So crowding out is this idea that you might try to make big increases in government spending, but that's really going to do is just replace private sector spending. And so when the government steps in, tries to enact big spending, tries to spend a lot of money, that's actually not going to have big effects because it's just going to be replacing one component of aggregate demand with another. And so, sort of summarize, macro instability is frequently caused by improper macroeconomic policy. So again, this is the monetarist view, which tends to be more of a, wanting the Fed to be less active, to have this sort of preset policy where you expand the money supply at a steady rate. So what we'll do is we'll take these ideas when we look at the different viewpoints and and see how they translate to the graphs we've looked at. So monetarist view says increases in the money supply shift aggregate demand to the right. Remember, we've talked about that. Money supply increases, interest rates go down, we get more investment. So aggregate demand shifts to the right. Okay, next thing that happens is adjustments from aggregate supply bring the economy back to its long run potential. So this is where we've talked about aggregate demand increases. What does that do? That puts us to the point where real GDP is actually above the equilibrium rate. So we're in expansion. We have the economy's growing sort of at an unsustainable pace. We're all working overtime. Unemployment's very low. So then what happens is you go for your review at the end of the year. You tell your boss you need a raise or else you'll quit for another job. Your boss gives you a raise. You said when that happens, that serves as a cost increase for the firm. So aggregate supply shifts back to the left. So adjustments from aggregate supply bring the economy back to its long run potential. Notice we started off here, we wound up here. So it's saying in the long run, increases in the money supply create higher price levels. Notice that we started off by increasing the money supply. That led to aggregate demand increasing, but that also just led to aggregate supply decreasing. So when we started here, wound up here, the main impact in the long run is on prices and not output. So changing the money supply in the long run didn't actually affect output. Right? Our price level went up, but our real GDP stayed the same. Next, we're going to talk about real business cycle theory. And we say real business cycle theory, we're not trying to differentiate it from like fake business cycle theory. What we're thinking about is we're differentiating real changes from changes in the money supply. Just like how real GDP is meant to separate actual changes in the amount of stuff we produce from changes in prices. Real business theory is trying to separate changes in the money supply from actual fundamental differences from what our economy can produce. So real business cycle theory says that instability in the macroeconomy comes from real economic events. So what do we mean by that? Well, Technological innovation, that could be a big thing that affects the macroeconomy, or changes in resource ability. So if we need some kind of stuff to make the whatever our country makes in our giant country factory, and that stuff's harder to acquire, well, that's a real economic event. That's not just something happening to the money supply. There is actually less stuff available for us. Often it's a change in the price of oil. So in the 1970s, there was a huge increase in the price of oil. That had major impacts on the economy. So let's consider a negative shock. So for example, a hurricane. Something comes along and destroys the production capacity of our country. Well, people immediately affected change their consumptions and investment decisions. Right? So maybe I lost my job because the factory was destroyed. Maybe I work at a restaurant in an area that was majorly affected by the hurricane, and I decide not to invest in my restaurant because there aren't as many customers as I thought there would be. And these actions affect the entire economy through a ripple effect. Sort of think of this ripple effect like the multiplier, right? I'm spending less money, so you're getting less money, and you're going to have less money to spend, and so on. So let's look at an example. We'll think about an increase in technology. So it becomes cheaper for us to make computer microchips, fast internet becomes more prevalent, something like that. That is going to lead to an increase in the long-run aggregate supply. Because if you remember, we said that long-run aggregate supply represents the total amount that our economy can produce, and it's dependent on the workers and the capital and the technology. So if we increase our technology, now all of a sudden we can produce more. We have the same factory, but now because we've improved the technology of the factory can produce more. What does that do? Well, that's going to take long-run equilibrium from here to here. And let's think about what just happened. We see an increase in GDP and a decrease in prices. Now, normally, if we weren't thinking about real business cycle, we might see the signs that we're getting this increase in GDP, and you could think, we're starting to enter an expansion, we're going to get inflation soon. But if we're accepting that this is actually a change in the long-run aggregate supply, if we're having a real shock to the business, to the macroeconomy, well, then we're not worried about inflation. Look, notice here we actually get deflation. This is actually an example I could show you. So this right here is a graph that perhaps a little messily shows inflation in blue and GDP growth in red. And what I want to highlight here is this area here. This is the late 90s. There was a tech boom going on. And that appears that it was an example of a real business cycle, a real business shock. Because notice what happens here. We get an increase in GDP. So notice this red here is showing that we're having really good GDP growth of about 4%. And we're doing this while still having low inflation. So the blue is low inflation. So if we have, and that's what we expect to happen when we have a real positive shock to the macroeconomy. So a real increase in long-run aggregate supplies. We get high GDP growth and low inflation. So strengths and weaknesses. Well, the biggest strength, and this is something I read when I was learning about this, preparing my lecture slides. It said, looking at the history of humanity, most business cycles are well explained by this model. Why? Because for the history of humanity, most economies were based around agriculture. And if we were thinking about the GDP of your country, it was mostly related to how much your country's agriculture produced. And so for real business cycle, what we would think about is weather and other factors affecting crop yields. So if we were measuring the GDP of country, places a couple of thousand years ago, we would have seen that, there was low GDP for this region, and the reason was not because somebody expanded the money supply. No, the cause of this lower GDP is what caused it was the fact that, we had a drought this year, we produced less. So that would be real business cycles. More recently, it is sometimes hard to find the technology shock that caused a recession, right? So we can look at recessions and say, I don't think there was some major change in technology there. Or we look at an expansion and we say, I didn't see some major innovation that should have affected the entire economy this much. So explains it really well a long time ago. More recently, sometimes it's hard to see exactly what the real business cycle would be triggering these expansions and recessions. Next, what we have is the self-correction view. What do we mean by that? Well, self-correction is basically this idea that the best remedy is to just let the economy sort itself out. That it's very difficult for governments or the Fed to accurately time and manipulate the economy, right? We've talked about how there's delays involved when we try to set monetary or fiscal policy. And the self-correction view is sort of arguing that those are actually really significant, and it's going to really inhibit your ability to successfully use fiscal and monetary policy. So whereas self-correction would say markets are more dynamic than governments. It takes governments a while to respond to a recession, whereas markets respond right away. And so we would say that they would argue that the economy will self-correct on its own faster than it would with intervention. We would say that shocks matter in the short run, but not the long run, right? So yes, in the short term, you might get this increase in aggregate demand that leads to inflation. But eventually, aggregate supply will sort itself out. This was the idea that during the Depression, well, there's unemployment now, but soon wages will come down enough that will reduce that unemployment. And this is sort of the viewpoint that Keynes was arguing against. This is what he was referring to when he said, in the long run, we're all dead. So the idea here is, well, this is a nice story. Shocks matter in the short run, but not the long run. Well, if you're one of those people unemployed in the short run, someone telling you that eventually things will work themselves out is not very helpful, which is why Keynes was advocating more of an activist role. Self-correction view, we're sort of saying, you know what, we might get shocks in the short run. They're not important in the long run. And even if we try to fix them, we're not going to do a good job of it. So we can look at a graph here. Suppose short-run aggregate supply shifts to the left. So we start off here, we move here. Output goes down, inflation and unemployment go up. Right? That's what we see. If we follow the pink circle, we started off here, we went here. So we get an increase in unemployment, the increase in unemployment because real GDP went down. And so what you would typically see, mainstream view would probably say, oh, well, we need to do something with the money supply to get us back to long-run equilibrium GDP. So probably what we'd want to do is increase the money supply, reduce interest rates, increase investment to help get us back towards where we need to be to equilibrium GDP. Well, self-correction view is going to say, don't worry about all that. This increase in unemployment, it's going to lead to lower wages. What happens then? Well, once wages go down, again, eventually we expect wages to go down because we've got all this unemployment, lots of people competing for your job. So the price of labor will go back down. And short-run aggregate supply will shift back to the right since the cost of production has gone down. So again, once labor costs fall, that will shift aggregate supply back to the right back where we started. Okay, next let's look at a demand shock. Let's suppose we're sitting here in long run equilibrium. And we get some, all of a sudden, everyone suddenly feels confident. We thinking that the economy is going to turn better. We all of a sudden, we saw the new PlayStation come out and decided that we want to go buy it. Something happens and it causes an increase in spending. What does that do? Well, and we've seen this several times. GDP increases, inflation increases. We're at a point where unemployment is below the natural rate, right? GDP is above long-run equilibrium, so we have employment that is too low. Unemployment in a sense that's lower than the natural rate. GDP is above the natural rate. Well, self-correcting view says, don't worry about that. Don't, if everyone wants to go buy a PlayStation, that's fine. We don't need to adjust the monetary money supply for that. Instead, just wait it out for the long run. In the long run, workers will demand higher wages. Aggregate supply will shift back to the left, right? Why are we demanding higher wages? Well, the people in the PlayStation factory are working overtime, and they're going to say, you know what? I'll go work in another factory unless you pay me more. At which point, that increases the wages of people working in the PlayStation factory. It also increases the wages elsewhere because I'll tell my boss, you better hire me or I'm going to pay me more. I'm going to go work in this PlayStation factory that's producing a lot. So workers demand higher wages. Aggregate supply shifts to the left. What happens then? Well, we see firms producing less and increasing their prices. Right now, my company is having to pay people more, so I'm not going to hire as many people. And my costs have gone up, so I'm increasing my prices. So what happens? Unemployment goes back to the natural rate. Because equilibrium GDP goes back to goes back to Y star, the long run equilibrium. So we go from here back to here once we have to give people raises. Prices are permanently higher and real GDP is unchanged. So again, what we've done in the self-correcting view says, you know what? We had this increase in aggregate demand. We don't need to adjust the money supply. No, just wait it out. Aggregate supply will shift back. We'll wind up right where we started. Next, suppose there is a permanent negative supply shock. So for whatever reason, this is the hurricane comes and destroys some of our economy. And a bunch of our factories are ruined. And maybe some of our resources are destroyed. So we have some permanent negative supply shock. Long run aggregate supply shifts left. The cost of production increased, so short-run aggregate supply also shifts left or down until output is at the new full employment GDP. So again, what's going on then is after we get this decrease in long-run aggregate supply, so what that means is that it is now harder. Everything I'm producing is now more expensive. There's not as much oil to go around, so I'm going to have to pay more for oil. One of my factories got destroyed, so I have to pay to rebuild it, so on. So once that happens, that is a cost of production. We've said that when costs of production increase, short-run aggregate supply shifts left or down. It's funny, we call it down because it's decrease. You think of it as a decrease. The curve actually looks higher. So short-run aggregate supply shifts left until output is at the new full employment GDP. So once that happens, moves us over to here. And once again, we started off at here. Get a decrease in long-run aggregate supply and a decrease in short-run aggregate supply, which means that now we get back to the point where aggregate demand intersects aggregate supply intersects long-run aggregate supply at one point, which is right here. Up and to the left. I see that there were some people who were concerned that we didn't have Top Hat today. Well, I have great news for you. Here we go. Just a second to turn it on. So I've got, I think it's 4 questions. And these are going to be more like the kind of questions you could see in an exam. I know I kind of threw a lot of stuff at you earlier with graphs and stuff to illustrate it. But most of the kind of questions you'll see here, pretty straightforward. And these are the kinds of things you could expect to see. So first question, in the mainstream view, macroeconomic instability is caused by what? All right, so the answer here, let me go over it again. The answer here is A. So mainstream view, we think mostly about shocks to aggregate demand, which are done through changes in expenditures. All right, next one. Hopefully nobody saw that. In real business cycle theory, macroeconomic instability is caused by what? Answer to this one is C. So real business cycle theory, we think macroeconomic instability is caused by technological change and innovation. So this is the idea that, technological change could be good in the form of, some new invention, we've made microchips faster, or it could be in the form of bad, like there's a reduction in the amount of oil available or a hurricane shows up. Next question. Which school of thought would be most likely to agree to make this statement? In a recession, we should just leave the economy alone. Prices and wages will sort themselves out and lead to a recovery. Good. The answer here is C, self-correction. Next, which school of thought would be most likely to make this statement? The Great Depression was made worse because the Fed tightened the money supply too much.
I'm back.
All right. So the answer here is monetarist. What's up? That's okay. So monetarist, again, talked about how tightening the money supply is bad and has bad effects. Okay? So you can jump down, Claire. I'll move the chair.
Okay.
So Madeline, what big thing happened to you this morning?
My tooth fell out.
Hey.
What about me?
Well, did you have a tooth fall out? No? Okay. Well, did you do anything else this morning?
I'm learning about candy.
You're learning about candy.
How candy was made.
Oh, how's candy made?
I haven't really gotten to that part. I'm learning about what people did with no candy.
What people did before they invented candy?
Yeah, they had used fruit and honey, but then
Well, that doesn't sound as good as candy.
But then these new people came and they invented a whole new kind of candy.
Is this a real story or is this a pretend story?
It's real. It's from a long time ago.
Oh, is it from you've been learning about stuff that happened a long time ago, huh?
Yeah. But
all right. Claire, what have you been up to this morning?
Doing my pumpkin class.
Your pumpkin class?
Yeah.
Oh.
Class.
All right. So we're going to sing the goodbye song. And maybe more people will turn their cameras on so you can see how many people there are. And everyone's going to sing. I know it, Maddie. All right. So are you ready?
Lots of people.
Look at all those people. All right.
Many.
Are you ready?
Mm-hmm.
Goodbye now.
Goodbye
now.
now.
Have a good weekend.
Says we're done. We'll see you on Monday to have lots of fun. Who's terrific? We are!
We are!
All right.